I had told the preacher's wife, in plain words, that I wanted a quiet woman, a woman who could keep a house and hold her tongue and not look at me too long across a supper table. So when the noon stage came up the Briar Gap Road in a roll of yellow dust, and a woman climbed down arguing with the driver before her boots ever touched the dirt, I knew the Lord had heard me and laughed. "You'll bring that trunk down gentle," she was saying to Cobb up on the box, "or you'll fish my mother's plates out of the creek your own self." She had a carpet-bag in one hand and a rifle case in the other, and she set them both in the road like a woman planting a flag. I stood by the rail in front of Hadley's Mercantile with my hat in my hands and my heart going like a green colt's, and I will tell you the truth, because I am old now and there is no profit left in lying. My first thought was that there had been some mistake. My second thought was that I ought to get back on my horse and ride for the two-seaters, and let the next stage carry her wherever stubborn women went. I did neither. I have spent the better part of 40 years being glad I did neither. "You'd be Mrs. Hartwell," I said. She turned and looked me over the way you'd look over a horse a man was trying to sell you cheap. Up the boots, across the shoulders, a long pause at the face. She was not what the letter had led me to expect, and I expect I was not what she had hoped for either. She was tall for a woman, brown from the road, with a jaw that had clearly been told no a great many times and decided against it every time. There was dust in the part of her hair and a tear in her sleeve, and a look in her eye that I would come to know better than I knew my own pulse. A look that said she had been knocked down hard enough times to lose all interest in staying down. "I'd be Della Hartwell," she said, "and you'd be the man who wrote that he wanted a wife who knew her place." "I wrote that I wanted a wife who could keep a house." "You wrote both." She reached into her coat and took out my own letter, folded soft from handling, and read off it in a flat voice that made the words sound a good deal worse than I'd meant them. "A sensible, quiet woman who will not trouble me with talk and will be content to keep my house and stay out of my way." She folded it back up. "Mister, I have been content exactly one day in my whole life, and I spent it asleep." Behind me I heard Hadley snort, and a couple of the loafers on the Mercantile porch made the kind of sounds men make when they are enjoying a thing that is not happening to them. I felt my neck go hot. "There's been a misunderstanding," I said. "There's been no misunderstanding at all," she said. "You sent away for furniture and a person showed up. It happens. Now, is your wagon the one with the broke tailgate or the one with the good team?" "The one with the good team." "Then I'll ride in that one." And she picked up her bag and her rifle and walked past me toward my wagon, as though the matter of whether she was coming at all had been settled by somebody higher up than the both of us. That is how I met the woman I would spend my life with. I have heard prettier stories. I have never believed a one of them. My name is Asab Brandt, and in the year the stage brought Della up the Briar Gap Road I was 41 years old and had been a widower for 6 of them. I ran cattle on the two-seaters, a middling spread on Cinder Creek under the long blue wall of the Sawtooth benchland, and I will not pretend it was a soft life. It was a country that took more than it gave and seemed to enjoy doing it. I had buried my wife Mara there in the spring of a bad year, of a fever that took her in 9 days while I rode 40 miles and back for a doctor who arrived in time to tell me what I already knew. I had put her under the two-seaters that gave the place its name, and after that I had done what a hard man does, which is to get harder. I will not dress up what I was in those years. I was a grim, closed-up man who worked his hands to the bone because work was the one thing that asked nothing of my heart. I had a foreman named Pratt who had been on the place longer than I had and who said maybe 4 sentences a month, and that suited the both of us fine. The ranch ran. The cattle fattened or died as the year decided. And in the evenings, I sat in a house with one chair pulled up to the stove, and the other 6 pushed back against the wall where no one would ever sit in them again. It was Pratt, of all the silent men in the territory, who finally said something. We were stringing wire on the North Line in a cold wind, and he said, around the staples in his teeth, A man can grieve so long it stops being grief and just gets to be a habit. I told him to mind his fence. But the preacher's wife, Mrs. Goff, was not a woman who could be told to mind her fence, and she had got it into her head that I was a soul in need of saving from myself. It was she who put the matrimonial paper in front of me. It was she who all but held my hand on the pen. And it was she who, when I wrote that I wanted a quiet woman who'd stay out of my way, looked at the letter and said, "Asab Brant, you don't want a wife. You want a ghost that cooks." I told her she could pray for me. She said she had been for years, and look where it had got the both of us. So when the stage rolled in, and the answer to my prayer climbed down hollering at Cobb about her mother's plates, you might say I had been warned. I had not listened. I have never been good at listening. It is, I would learn, the one thing Della and I had truly in common, and it nearly broke us more times than the country did. The ride out to the 2-seaters was 9 miles, and she filled every one of them. Not with chatter. I would learn she had no patience for chatter, but with questions, sharp ones, the kind a buyer asks. How many head was I running? Where did I water them in a dry year? Why was the off-horse favoring his near fore, and had Pratt look at the frog of that hoof, or just assumed it was the shoe? I answered what I could and was caught flat on the rest. And by the time the cedars showed dark against the bench, I had the uncomfortable sense of having been examined and found wanting on several counts. "You don't talk much," she said, when the house came in sight. "No." "Good," she said. "I've buried 2 men who couldn't shut their mouths. A quiet man's arrest." She looked at the house, the low log house with its one lit window, and something in her face changed, went still and careful, the way water goes still when it's gone deep. "Who keeps it for you now?" "I do." "It shows," she said, but she said it gentler than I'd have thought her able to. We had it out that first night, what we both knew had to be had out. I had built a fire and put coffee on, because whatever else I was not going to make a woman cook the hour she came off a 3-week journey, and we sat across the table from each other in the lamplight like 2 parties to a treaty neither one trusted. "I'll tell you plain," I said, "I wasn't expecting you." "You were expecting a girl who'd be grateful," she said. "Some poor thing the world had used so bad she'd take a roof and a silent man and call it a mercy." I did not answer that, because it was exactly what I had been expecting, and we both knew it, and there was no point in the both of us pretending otherwise. "I was that girl once," she said. "First marriage. I was 17 and grateful for everything, and it nearly killed the woman in me before the man even got the chance to. Second time I married a good one, finally, a man who let me be what I was. He learned me to shoot and to doctor stock and to read a brand, and he never once told me my place, because he knew I'd have shown him mine." She turned her cup in her hands. "He went through the ice on the Cutbank crossing 4 winters ago, hauling another man's child out by the collar. The child lived, so I don't grieve it the way you'd grieve a waste, but I grieve it." She looked up at me, and there it was again. That look I would learn was the truest thing about her, not hardness, though it wore like hardness. It was a refusal, a flat, bone-deep refusal to be put on the ground and kept there. After he died, I had a house, and no man and the whole county decided that was a problem they were owed an opinion about. So I answered an advertisement that said a man wanted a quiet wife. Not because I'm quiet, because I was through letting people who hadn't earned it decide my business for me, and I figured a man 900 miles away couldn't manage it any worse than the ones close to home. "That's a hard way to choose a husband," I said. "You chose a wife off a sheet of newsprint," she said. "Don't lecture me on hard ways to choose." I almost smiled. I wanted on the record that I did not, but I almost did. And it had been a long time since I had even come close. "Here's my terms," she said, and laid them out like cards. She would stay through to the first hard frost, call it a season, before there was any talk of a preacher. She would have her own room. She would have her own horse and her own say in how the place ran, because she did not intend to live the rest of her life in a house where she was a guest. And if at the end of the season either one of us judged it a mistake, She would take the stage back east, and I would never hear a word of complaint from her, and she would expect the same courtesy. "And if I don't agree to all that," I said, "then I'll sleep in the barn tonight and walk to town tomorrow and be no worse off than half the women I know who married the easy way." She said it without heat. That was the thing about Della, she never bluffed. I would lay everything I owned in time on whether Della Hartwell was bluffing, and I never once lost. I sat there in my own kitchen feeling like a man who had set out to buy a quiet horse and found himself holding the lead rope of something with a good deal more horse in it than he'd planned for. And under the surprise, under the put-out feeling, there was something I had not felt in 6 years and did not have a name ready for. It was a long while before I understood it was interest. "A man can grieve so long," Pratt had said. "It stops being grief and gets to be a habit, and habits are quiet." And into all my quiet, this woman had come in like a thrown rock through a window I'd forgotten was glass. "Frost comes early up here," I said. "You may not last the season." "I've lasted worse than weather," she said, "and worse than you." I gave her Mara's room. I had not opened the door to it in 6 years. I opened it that night and stood in it a moment with the lamp, and then I made the bed up fresh, and I did not let myself feel what I felt, and Della Hartwell slept under my roof, and I lay awake in mine listening to the cedars move in the wind and wondering what in God's name I had done. She was up before me. I want that understood, because it never once stopped being true. In all our years together, I beat Della Hartwell out of bed perhaps a dozen times, and 10 of those she was sick. That first morning I came out grim and braced for an argument over coffee and found her already in the lot with my bad-footed horse, his near fore-up between her knees, pawing at the frog with my own hoof knife she'd found God knew where. "Gravel," she said, not looking up. "Up under here, festering. No wonder he's been short. Whoever shot him last drove a nail too close, and you've been treating a lameness that was really a abscess." She set the foot down, and the horse, who did not let me touch that foot without a fight, stood for her like a lamb. "He'll want a poultice in a few days. You got bran, Epsom salts." I stood there at my own corral rail being instructed about my own horse by a woman I'd known 18 hours, and I felt the old familiar heat come up my neck. And then, and this surprised me as much as anything had in years, it just went on past, the way a wave goes under a boat instead of swamping it. Because she was right. She was plainly, demonstrably right, and the horse was the proof of it, standing 3-legged and grateful in the morning cold. "I got Epsom salts," I said. "Then we're in business," she said. And that, more than the terms or the treaty or any of it, was the first true morning of the rest of my life. A sick horse, a cold lot, and a woman who'd found the trouble I'd been walking past for a month. It did not make us friendly. I want to be honest about the shape of it, because the cheap way to tell this story would be to say the fire melted the ice and we fell to it sweet as pie, and that is not how it went, and it would dishonor the both of us to pretend. We clashed. Lord, how we clashed. We clashed about the herd and the hay and the way I broke horses, which she said was the way a frightened man breaks a horse, all rope and no patience, and which she proceeded to prove by gentling a 3-year-old filly I'd given up on in 2 weeks without a harsh word, until the animal followed her around the lot like a dog. We clashed about money, because she found my books and informed me I had been letting the bank at Briar Gap, and a man named Royce Vane skinned me on every dealing for years, because I would rather lose a little money than have a long conversation. We clashed about the chairs. That one I remember. I came in one evening and found all 6 chairs pulled up to the table, where they belonged, where they hadn't been since Mara died, and the sight of them stopped me in the doorway like a fist. "They were against the wall," I said. "They were in the way," she said from the stove. "A chair's for sitting in." "That's not your business to decide." She turned around then, and she had flour on her hands and her sleeves shoved up, and she looked at me a long moment, and her voice when it came was not soft, but it was not unkind either. "How many were there?" she said. "How many what?" "Chairs you pushed back, People who used to sit in them, how many? I did not answer. I went out and split wood until it was full dark, and when I came in the chairs were still at the table, all six, and I sat down in mine and ate the supper she'd kept warm, and I did not move a one of them. And I have not moved them since, not in 40 years, though most of them sit empty now and one of them, but I'm getting ahead. The point is she was right about the chairs too. A chair's for sitting in. A heart's the same, it turns out, though it took me a deal longer to learn it than it took the horse. The county made up its mind about Della inside of a month, and the county was against her. I should have stood up for her sooner than I did. That's one of the things I'd take back if a man got to take things back. It started at the turkey shoot. Briar Gap held one every fall, the men shooting at a mark for a side of beef and bragging rights that lasted till spring, and I went because I always went, and Della came because she'd be hanged before she'd sit home while there was shooting to be done. She'd brought that rifle case down off the stage, and I'd assumed it held some keepsake. It held a good sharps and a woman who knew what to do with it. There is a particular silence that falls over a crowd of men when a woman steps up to a firing line, and a particular different silence that falls when she outshoots all of them, and I heard both that day. She put 5 in the black at 200 yards while Royce Vane's foreman was still explaining to her that the recoil might be more than she'd cared for. The crowd didn't cheer. That's the thing I remember. A man wins that shoot, they pound his back. Della won it, and the men just got quiet and looked at each other, and Mrs. Goff went pink, and I heard a fellow behind me say, "Lo, no wonder Brant keeps her up the creek where decent folks don't have to look at her." I should have turned around and broke his jaw. I did not. I was a man so unused to caring what was said that I'd forgotten you were supposed to. I stood there, and Della collected her side of beef and walked it to the wagon herself, and on the ride home she was quiet, truly quiet, the only time I ever wished her so, and finally she said, "You didn't say anything." There wasn't anything to say. There was a man behind you said I was something to be ashamed of, and you stood there. I didn't take it serious. I know you didn't, she said. That's the trouble. You don't take anything serious enough to fight for it. You let Vane skin you, and you let the bank skin you, and you let a man in a crowd call me a thing decent folks shouldn't have to look at, and you stand there like it's weather. I didn't come west to be a thing a man tolerates, Asa. I had that. I'd sooner have the open road. It was the first time she'd used my given name, and she'd used it to take the hide off me, and I deserved it, and it sat with me a long while. Because she was right about that too, and it was getting to be a habit, her being right, and the worst of it was I was starting not to mind. A man who has been alone 6 years forgets there is a particular comfort in another person seeing him clear, even the parts of him that don't bear looking at. Especially those. I did not apologize. I should have. But the next Sunday in Briar Gap I found the fellow who'd said it, in front of the mercantile, in front of God and Mrs. Goff and everybody, and I told him in a level voice that Della Hartwell was a better shot than he was, a better hand than he was, and a better person than he was, and that if he had something further to say about her, he could say it to me with his hands. He did not have anything further to say. And when I climbed back in the wagon, Della was looking at me with an expression I'd not seen on her before, and she didn't say anything either, but she sat a little closer on the seat than she had to, all the 9 miles home, and I let her, and the country went by gold and blue, and I thought, well, now. The trouble with Royce Vane came on slow and then all at once, the way real trouble does. Vane ran the anchor, the big spread that took up the whole far side of the Sawtooth bench, and he had a way of growing that involved a great many small ranchers selling out to him for less than their places were worth, generally after a run of bad luck that arrived sudden and left when they signed. A fence cut here. A water hole gone foul there. A buyer for their beef that fell through at the last, with Vane's man right handy to make a low offer. It was the kind of thing a man couldn't prove and couldn't ignore, and I'd watched 3 neighbors go under it in 5 years, and told myself it was none of my affair, because that was the kind of man I'd let myself become. That summer it came to the 2 cedars. Cinder Creek went low in July, lower than the dry should have made it, and when I rode up to see why, I found the spring that fed it had been dug out and turned, just enough, just careful enough that you'd take it for a slump in the bank if you didn't know what you were looking at. I knew what I was looking at. Della had taught me to look. Then the well by the house went bad. We'd been getting sweet water out of it for 20 years, and overnight it came up foul, oily, undrinkable, and the cattle wouldn't touch the trough. I stood over it cussing, and Della came and dipped a finger and smelled it and said, "Coal oil. Somebody's poured coal oil down your well." She wiped her hand on her apron. "Your man Vane wants this place. He's made offers. And now he's making the other kind." She looked up at the bench where the anchor lay. "What are you going to do about it?" And here is where I learned the difference between us, the difference that was the whole marriage in one moment. Because my whole life, faced with a thing like that, I'd have done what I always did, pulled my horns in, gone harder, weathered it, sold off a little dignity to keep the peace, told myself a man can't fight everybody. And Della stood there at the poisoned well, and what she wanted to know was not whether we could win. She did not care whether we could win. She wanted to know whether I'd stand up. "He's got 30 men," I said, "and money in the bank and the county half in his pocket. A man can't fight all that." "A man can fight all that," she said. "He might lose, but he can fight it. The question's only ever whether he will." She came and stood close to me, close enough that I could see the dust in the part of her hair, and she said lower, "I've been knocked down by men like Vane my whole life. The ground's no stranger to me, but I'll tell you what I learned getting up off it as many times as I have. They count on you staying down. The whole machine of them, it only runs on the one thing, that a decent person, knocked down hard enough, will figure it's easier to stay there. You take that one bet away from a man like Vane, and you'd be surprised how little he's actually got." I did not say anything for a while. Then I said, "We'll need that well cleaned and a guard on the spring." And she smiled, the first full smile I'd had off her, and it changed her whole face. It took 20 hard years off it, and she said, "Now you're some use," and went to fetch the rope and the bucket, and we cleaned that well together till midnight, the two of us hauling fouled water up out of the dark and pouring it off down the slope, and it was the hardest, filthiest, finest evening I'd spent in 6 years. And somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped thinking of her as a mistake the stage had brought me, and started thinking of her as the best thing that had ever climbed down off it. We fought Vane's squeeze through the back half of that summer the way two stubborn people fight a thing, badly, sometimes, and at cross purposes, and with a great deal of arguing, but we never once stayed down. He cut our south fence and we mended it and rode the line at night, turn and turnabout, her 4 hours and me 4. And I'll tell you, there is a particular feeling to riding in to find your wife. She wasn't my wife yet, but I'd quit thinking of it any other way, sitting a horse on a moonlit ridge with a rifle across the saddle bow, watching your line and saying, "Quiet night," as easy as if she'd been doing it her whole life, which, in a way, she had. He turned a buyer against us. The man who took our beef most years sent word he'd changed his plans, and I knew Vane's hand in it the way you know a smell. And Della sat down with my books, which she'd long since made her own, and figured out that if we drove the herd ourselves the extra 40 miles to the railhead at the next county, we'd clear more than the buyer had ever paid us, and Vane couldn't touch a sale that far out of his country. So we drove them ourselves, the two of us and Pratt and a couple of boys we hired, and it was a hard drive and a good one, and we came home with money in the wagon and the better of Royce Vane for the first time in anybody's memory. And somewhere on that drive, I think it was the third night, by a little fire on the Cutbank Flats, the herd settled and Pratt asleep and the boys off with the horses. Somewhere in there it stopped being a treaty between us. She was telling me about the husband who'd gone through the ice, telling it plain, not asking for any pity, and I found I'd taken her hand across the little fire and she'd let me, and we sat like that a long while not saying much. Two people who'd both been knocked down by the world and got up so many times that getting up had become the truest thing either of us knew how to do, and finding, late and unlooked for, that it was a deal easier to get up with somebody's hand in yours. I will not tell more of that night than that. The country was wide and the fire was low, and a man's allowed to keep some things. But I'll tell you, I rode the rest of that drive a different man than I'd started it. And when we came up the Briar Gap road toward home with the money in the wagon, I looked at Della Hartwell on the seat beside me, and I knew, the way you know the weather's about to break, that the season she'd set herself was nearly run, and that I had something I had to say before the frost, and that I was, God help me, a coward about exactly one thing left in the world, and it was her. I made a mess of it. Of course I did. I have made a mess of every important thing I ever did the first time, and the only grace in my life is that I have generally been given a second chance to make it right, mostly by Della, who had more patience for my failures than I had any right to. It was the grave that did it. The first hard frost came, the season was up, and I knew I had to speak. And instead of speaking, I went funny and cold the way I do when I'm scared. And I picked a fight over nothing, over the chairs again, of all the fool things, over her having put fresh flowers on Mara's grave under the 2 cedars, which she'd done as a kindness, as one widow to a woman she'd never met but felt she'd come to know, and which I, in my fear, threw back at her like an insult. "That's not your place," I said, the same words, the very same words I'd said about the chairs, the worst words I owned. "You didn't know her, leave her be." And Della went still, that deep water still, and she set down what she was holding, and she said, "You're right, I didn't know her. But I know you, and I know a man who'd rather tend a grave than build a life, because the grave can't disappoint him and the life can. The dead are safe to love, Asa. They can't leave. That's the whole of why you sent away for a quiet wife you could keep at arm's length. You wanted somebody it wouldn't cost you anything to lose." She picked up her bag from where it had sat by the door these months, the carpet bag she'd come with. "The season's up. You set the terms a season, and either of us could call it a mistake and the other'd let them go without a word of complaint." Her voice did not shake. I'd have borne it better if it had shook. "I'm calling it. There's a stage Thursday. I'll be on it." She went to the barn and made up a bed in the loft and would not come in, and I sat in the house with all 6 chairs at the table and every one of them full of ghosts, and I want to tell you I went straight out and made it right, but I am telling this true. I sat there 2 days. 2 days like the coward I was about the one thing. Pratt finally said his 4 sentences for the month. He came in Wednesday night and stood by the stove and said, "She cleaned your well. She broke that filly. She drove your herd and saved your place and beat Vane that you never could." He picked up his hat. "And you're going to let her get on a stage Thursday because you're afraid of feeling something you've decided you can't afford. I worked for your father and I worked for you, and I never once thought either of you was a fool till right now." And he went out, and that was the most words I ever heard the man speak, before or after, and they were the right ones, and they cost him to say, and I have never forgotten them. But it was Vane that settled it in the end. Vane, who could not abide losing, and who chose that Thursday morning, the morning of the stage, to make his last play, because his kind always overplays the hand. That's the one mercy of them. I was saddling to ride to town behind the stage, with no plan past getting there and saying something, anything, when his men came down off the bench. 8 of them with Vane himself, which told me how rattled the herd drive had left him, that he'd come in person. They came to fire the place. That was the old play, the last play, burn a man out and buy the ashes, and they figured to do it with me alone, because they'd had the road watched and knew the woman was leaving on the stage and the foreman was up the creek. What they did not know was that the stage had thrown a wheel 2 miles out, and that Della Hartwell, rather than sit in the road waiting on a repair, had taken her bag and her sharps and walked back to the 2 cedars to wait for the next one, because Della Hartwell had never in her life sat still waiting on anybody, and because, she told me, after she had got 2 miles down that road and found she could not make her feet carry her any farther from the place, and had told herself it was only good sense not to waste a morning. So when Royce Vane's 8 men spread out across my yard with their torches not yet lit, and Vane himself sat his big horse and told me in his oily way that he was sorry to see me come to this, but a man had to know when he was beat. When all that was happening, there came a flat, carrying voice from the loft of my own barn, behind and above the lot of them, where a window looked down on the whole yard. "First man lights a match," said Della, "loses the hand that holds it. I put 5 in the black at 200 yards in front of half this county, gentlemen. You're inside of 40. You have never seen 8 men go so still." Vane's head came round, and I watched it happen, the thing she'd told me at the poisoned well. I watched the machine of them seize up, because it ran on the one bet that a decent person knocked down would stay down, and here was a person they'd counted out, up in a window with a rifle and not 1 ounce of give in her voice, and the whole arithmetic of it came apart in their hands. "You can't shoot all of us," Vane said, but it came out thin. "No," said Della pleasantly. "I figure to shoot you. The rest can do as they like after, but you'll not be here to enjoy the spread." A pause. "And Mr. Brand at your back has a Winchester and a temper he's only lately learned to use. You came to burn out 1 tired man. You found 2 people who don't stay down. That was your whole miscalculation, and it's a bad one, and I'd think hard about the stage road while you've still got a sound horse to take it." And I will tell you what I did then that I had not done in years, what she had been waiting on me to do since the day a man behind me in a crowd called her a thing decent folks shouldn't look at. I stepped out from the horse, into the open, into the middle of my own yard with 8 men around me, and I said, not loud, "She means it. So do I. There's not enough money on the anchor to make this worth what it's about to cost you, Vane. Ride off my place." It hung there a long, long moment. The frost smoked off the ground. Somewhere the filly Della'd broke nickered in the lot. And then Royce Vane, who had taken half the country by betting that good people would rather fold than fight, looked up at that window and down at me and did the arithmetic one last time and came up short. And he turned his big horse and rode off my place, and his men went with him, and they none of them ever came back. Not him, nor his torches, nor his foul wells. A man like that, it turns out, has nothing at all once you stop agreeing to lose to him. Della had it exactly right. She had a way of having things exactly right. The marks of his squeeze came out over that winter, the doctored brands and the bought buyers and the rest. Once a few of us who'd been beat separately found the nerve to stand together, which is a story for another night, but ends with Vane selling out cheap and leaving the country, eaten by the same machine he'd run, and the small spreads on the bench breathing easy for the first time in a decade. We did that together, the lot of us. But it started in my yard, with a woman in a barn window who would not stay down, and a man who finally stood up beside her. But I have left the most important part for last, the way a man saves the one true thing. When Vane's dust had settled on the road, Della came down out of the loft with the sharps over her arm, and she crossed the yard to where I stood, and she set the rifle against the rail, and she looked at me. And I knew it was the moment, the one I'd been a coward about, the one thing left in the world that scared me, and I knew that if I let it go by I'd deserve the empty chairs the rest of my days. "You were right," I said. "It is not easy for me to say those words. I have said them most often to her, and they have never come easy, and they have never once been wrong. About the grave, about the chairs, about all of it. I sent away for a wife I could keep at arm's length because I was afraid of what it'd cost me to love somebody who could leave. And then the stage brought me you who I couldn't keep at arm's length to save my life, and I've spent a season being scared of the one good thing that ever happened to me. I had to stop and start again. I don't want you on that stage, Della, not Thursdays, not any. I'm asking you to stay, not as a hired wife, not on terms, as, and the word stuck the way the true ones do, as my partner, my equal, the other half of this place and of me. I'm asking. The choosing's yours. It was always going to be yours. I just didn't have the sense to say so." She looked at me a good while. Della never rushed a true answer. She'd seen too many bad ones rushed. "On my terms," she said. "Still, always, my own horse, my own say. My name stays Hartwell on the brand alongside yours because I didn't get this far to disappear into a man." "Done," I said. "All of it done before you asked. And no man calls me a thing to be ashamed of, ever again, in your hearing, without you setting them right. I broke that one's habit of it on the mercantile porch, I said. I'll break the rest. And then Della Hartwell smiled the full smile, the one that took the hard years off her, and she put her hand in mine, calloused, sure, no give in it. The best hand I ever held, and she said, "Then I expect I'll stay. Somebody's got to teach you to break a horse." And she leaned up and kissed me once in my own frostbit yard with the whole long blue wall of the sawtooth bench going gold behind her, and I will keep the rest because a man's allowed. Mrs. Goff married us that spring under the 2 cedars, with Mara's grave tended sweet beside us, and the flowers on it that Della never once stopped putting there, because she was a woman big enough to honor the dead without being jealous of them, which is a kind of strength I have never seen the equal of. Pratt stood up for me and said no words at all, which from Pratt was a sermon. The whole bench came, the small ranchers we'd stood with, and there was a barn dance after, and I danced with my wife in my own barn under the same loft window she'd faced down 8 men from, and I was 41 years old and I had never danced sober in my life, and I did it badly and she laughed at me and I did not mind. I have never minded Della laughing at me. It is the warmest sound I know. We had near 40 years. I'll not pretend they were all easy. We were 2 hard, stubborn people, and we clashed to the very end, over the herd and the books and the way I still broke a horse with too much rope, and we never once managed to get up at the same time of the morning. But we never went down and stayed there. Not either of us, not once, not in 40 years, because the one thing we'd each learned alone before we ever met, that you get up, that the whole trick of a hard life is just to keep getting up, we learned to do together with the other one's hand to take, and a hand to take is the difference between enduring a life and living one. I know that now. I didn't. Before the stage came up the Briar Gap road in a roll of yellow dust. She's under the 2 cedars now beside Mara, where she said she wanted to be, the 3 of us then, and you'll have a lot to answer for when you come, she said, near the end, and she was laughing even then. Her chair's at the table still with the other 5. I don't push it back against the wall. A chair's for sitting in, she taught me, and a heart's the same, and I keep hers full the only way left to me, which is to sit in mine across from it of an evening and tell her how the day went, the herd and the books and the weather, the way I never could tell anybody before her and have not been able to tell anybody since. I sent away for a meek little wife who'd keep my house and hold her tongue. The Lord, who has a sense of humor I've come to be grateful for, sent me a woman who could outshoot my whole crew, outwork the lot of us, and would not take an order from any man alive, my own self included. I would not change one round of it. Not one. She was the best fight of my life, and I won by losing every argument that mattered, and I'd send that letter again tomorrow if I thought the same stage would bring me the same answer, climbing down arguing, planting her trunk in the road like a flag. You don't get those twice. I knew it the first morning at the corral rail, watching her find the trouble I'd been walking past. I just hadn't the sense yet to say so. I have the sense now. It only took losing her to finish the lesson she spent a lifetime teaching me, and the lesson is this, and I'll leave it with you the way she left it with me, at a poisoned well, on the hardest, finest evening of my life. They count on you staying down. That's all they've ever got. Take that one bet away and get up and find a hand to take while you're at it, and you'd be surprised, you would be purely surprised, how little the rest of it can do to you after that.